One of the great strengths of PHP is its ability to process our application's form data on the server side. In fact, we could go a step further and generate the forms using PHP code. We've generated HTML from within our PHP code, so we know how to do that. Here's an example of a simple login form. It has two fields, username and password. It's beyond the scope of this course to discuss the HTML form tag. However, this is a simple example with two fields, username and password. The action associated with this form is to call the process login PHP file and pass the data from the form to that file using the post method. So a user's browser, the client, communicates with our server with either the get or the post method. The same data is transmitted with either get or post. However, the mechanism for the transmission is significantly different. With the get method, the form data is passed in the query string and is therefore visible. So we should never use it for sensitive data like usernames and passwords. In contrast, the post method passes the data back to the server in the HTTP body so that it is not visible. Another big difference is that the get method may actually be limited in the amount of data that can be sent back, whereas the post method has no limit. In both cases, the get and the post store the form data in key value pairs, giving us access to that data on the PHP side using the associative array syntax that we're comfortable with. To access the data, PHP provides us Superglobals. This is a new concept. There's a set of superglobals that are populated automatically for us by the PHP preprocessor. Two of those are the get and the post superglobal. When the data is passed back to our server using either get or post, we can access that data using the get or post superglobal and the associative array syntax that we're already comfortable with. So let's go look at some code. Here's our login form. Simple form, username and password fields, and a submit button. Here's the code that generates that login form. The HTML code is, again, beyond the scope of this course. However, the action associated with the form is to call the process login.php file and pass the data via the post method. So the data is going to be encapsulated within the HTTP message body and passed to the process login.php file. We include the process login.php file with a require once command. In process login.php, the first thing we do is make sure that the username and password fields that are in the associative array in the post superglobal are not empty. Then we drop into the if block and we trim the values of username and password. The trim function deletes extra white space on each end of a string. So now we have a clean username and password, and we call the validate user function, passing those values, username and password, to that function. We've included the function using a require once command. In the validate user function, the first thing we do is read the contents of a text file named usercreds.txt. This file contains the username and passwords, comma delimited for our application. We read the contents of that file into the creds variable. Then we use a function called explode that uses the comma as the delimiter to load an array with all of the values in the creds string. We assign that array to the variable data. On line 19, we test the value of the elements in the data array against the username and password that was passed in to the validate user function. If both the username and password match those that we read from the user creds text file, using the header function, we redirect the user to a login success page. Otherwise, we echo an invalid login attempt message. So let's see how this works. And there we go. We are into the login success page. Had we failed the login, we would have gotten our invalid login attempt message. So a pretty straightforward way of processing a login form, or in fact any form, using PHP and the post method. Superglobals are built-in variables that are populated for us by the PHP preprocessor. These superglobals can be accessed from anywhere within our PHP application. We've seen two of these superglobals, the get and the post superglobals, that allow us to pass information from a form on the user's browser back to our server for processing. Here are a few other superglobals that allow us to access information about our server and even allow us to store bits of information on the user's computer in the form of a cookie. Now, there are 9 superglobals provided by PHP. However, there are known security vulnerabilities associated with the use of superglobals, and their use is no longer recommended because of those vulnerabilities. We'll leave it to you to research the superglobal vulnerabilities and make the determination on whether or not to use them yourself. Cookies are small bits of information that we can store on the user's computer on the client side. Common use of a cookie is to store a username and password, or the user's preferences on our website, or the date of the last visit on our website by that user, shopping cart contents, and other small bits of information that we can use to initialize the application when the user next visits. To write a cookie, we use the PHP function setCookie, which takes 3 arguments: the name of the value that we want to store, the value we want to store, and an expiration date of when that cookie will no longer be valid. To retrieve the data stored in a cookie, we use the cookie superglobal with the name of the value that we want to retrieve. A few gotchas associated with cookies is that we can't assume that the cookie exists, because a user may have deleted the cookie. The browser may be set not to accept cookies. And it's important to note that cookies are not shared between browsers. Now, we'll discuss the session superglobal. However, there are known security vulnerabilities that have been published associated with the session superglobal. The session superglobal is a variable that's used to track information related to a user's visit. The session superglobal stores temporary data. When the user leaves the site, the data is deleted. The basic mechanics for managing a session are: 1, to start the session. Once the session is started, we can store values associated with that session. And at any time, we can destroy the session with the session destroy function. To store values associated with a session, we use the session superglobal using the value name as the key. Then to retrieve that session data, again, we use the session superglobal and the value name as the key, which will return the value of that session variable. In this exercise, we'd like you to create a login form. A login form with 2 fields, one for username and password. When the user submits the form, transfer processing to a PHP file. Ensure that the user has provided the requested information, and if they haven't, then provide an error message. You could redirect them to an error page. If the required information is provided, then call your validate user function, passing the values that were provided by the user. Now modify your validate user function so that it reads the username and passwords from the usercreds.txt file. Then test the value that's passed into your validate user function against the values in the usercreds file to verify the user's username and password. If the values are not correct, then provide an error message or redirect to an error page. If the values are correct, then redirect the user to the loginsuccess.php page.